Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the corner of a near-empty supermarket parking lot, the low rumble of his motorcycle fading into the stillness. Across the asphalt, an elderly man pushed a row of shopping carts with agonizing slowness, his frail frame trembling under the weight of metal and time. A sharp voice sliced through the air. "Harold, if you worked faster, we wouldn't need two people for this." The manager's scorn echoing off the pavement. But what happened next would turn a mundane moment into something unforgettable, touching a life in ways no one saw coming. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting for you. It was late afternoon when Keanu Reeves pulled into the supermarket parking lot on his motorcycle. The engine's low rumble cut through the quiet as he steered the bike to a corner spot and killed the ignition. He stayed seated for a moment, hands resting on the handlebars, taking in the scene. The lot was mostly empty now. Shoppers had trickled out, leaving behind a scattering of carts and the faint hum of a distant car engine. Keanu adjusted the black cap pulled low over his eyes, his face half hidden. He wore a plain black jacket and jeans. Nothing flashy, but there was a quiet intensity about him, like he was waiting for something to happen. He'd been riding all day, no particular destination in mind, just letting the road lead him. This stop wasn't planned. He'd pulled off the highway for gas and ended up here, drawn by a hunch he couldn't quite name. Now, as he scanned the lot, his gaze settled on a figure near the store entrance. An older man was wrestling with a row of shopping carts, and something about the way he moved caught Keanu's attention. He didn't get off the bike yet, just watched, his hands tightening slightly on the grips. The guy looked worn down, but he kept going. Keanu tilted his head, curious. He'd seen plenty of people like that, folks carrying more than they should, but this one stood out. Maybe it was the stubborn set of his shoulders, or maybe it was just timing. Either way, Keanu decided to stick around. Harold was on his third row of carts when the manager showed up. His hands shook as he gripped the metal handles, pushing the clattering mess into some kind of order. He was old, late 60s, maybe more, his back bent from years of hard work. The blue store vest hung loose on his thin frame, and his breathing came in short, ragged bursts. He didn't stop, though. He couldn't. Every cart he lined up was another hour's pay, another chance to keep things together. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, focused, even as his knees ached with every step. Todd, the store manager, stepped out from the entrance, clipboard in hand. He was younger, mid-30s, with a pressed shirt and a scowl that said he didn't have time for this. "Harold, come on, pick up the pace," he snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the lot. "I don't want to hire someone else just because you're too slow. What's taking so long?" Harold paused, just for a second, his fingers flexing on the cart. He didn't look at Todd. "I'm getting it done, sir," he said, his voice low and steady, no trace of complaint. Todd huffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, get it done faster. We're not running a charity here." He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and headed back inside, leaving Harold standing there. Harold let out a slow breath, then went back to work. The carts rattled as he shoved them into place, each push a little harder than the last. He'd heard worse from Todd before. It didn't matter. He had bills piling up at home, a wife who needed him, and a job that barely covered it all. Stopping wasn't an option. He wiped his sleeve across his forehead, muttered something to himself, and kept going, oblivious to the pair of eyes watching him from across the lot. Keanu saw it all from his spot by the bike. Harold's shaky hands, the way he braced himself against the carts, the quiet grit in his movements. It hit something in him. Then Todd came out, barking orders like he owned the world, and Keanu's jaw clenched. He knew that type. Guys who talked big but wouldn't lift a finger themselves. Harold didn't fight back, didn't even flinch, just took it and kept working. That's what got Keanu. The guy was beat down but wouldn't quit. He'd seen that kind of resilience before, and it always stirred something in him. Anger, maybe, or just a need to do something about it. He swung his leg over the bike and started walking. His boots hit the pavement in steady steps, closing the distance to Harold fast. The old man didn't notice him until he was almost there, too focused on shoving a cart into line. It squeaked, resisting, and Harold grunted, pushing harder. Keanu stopped a few feet away and spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Need a hand with that?" Harold looked up, startled. His eyes flicked over Keanu, black jacket, cap, a faint smile, and he shook his head quick. "No, no need," he said, his tone gruff but polite. "I've got it. Been doing this a while." Keanu didn't move. He nodded toward the carts. "Looks like they're winning today," he said, that smile creeping wider. Harold opened his mouth to argue, but Keanu was already stepping in. He grabbed the nearest cart and pushed it into place, the metal clanging as it locked in. "Hey, you don't have to." Harold started, but Keanu cut him off with a shrug. "I know. I want to." He kept going, grabbing another cart, his movements smooth and sure. Harold stood there, caught off guard, watching this stranger take over like it was nothing. The guy didn't ask again, didn't make a big deal, just worked, lining up the carts with an ease Harold hadn't felt in years. After a beat, Harold gave in, stepping up to help. They fell into a rhythm, the clatter of the carts filling the silence between them. Todd poked his head out again, squinting across the lot. "Harold, who's that guy?" he called, suspicious. Harold glanced at Keanu, who didn't even look up, just kept pushing. "Just someone helping out," Harold said, keeping it vague. Todd frowned, lingered a second, then ducked back inside, grumbling. Keanu didn't react, didn't stop. He'd made up his mind the second he saw Harold take that hit from Todd and keep going. This wasn't about carts anymore. It was about something bigger, something he couldn't walk away from. Harold didn't know it yet, but Keanu wasn't leaving until he'd changed the old man's day, maybe more. The carts were finally in neat rows, and Harold leaned against one, catching his breath. His hands still trembled, but the ache in his back had eased a little with the work split in half. Keanu stood nearby, wiping his palms on his jeans, looking like he'd barely broken a sweat. The late afternoon light was fading fast, and the lot was quiet now. Just the two of them and the hum of traffic from the highway beyond. Harold glanced at Keanu, still unsure about this guy who'd stepped in out of nowhere. "Thanks for that," he said, nodding toward the carts. "Didn't expect it?" Keanu shrugged, hands in his pockets. "No big deal. Looked like you could use a break." He didn't push, just waited, his tone easy but steady. Harold hesitated, then sank onto the curb, stretching his legs out. His knees cracked as he moved, and he winced but waved it off. Keanu joined him, sitting a few feet away, close enough to talk but not crowding him. For a minute they just sat there, the silence comfortable. Then Harold spoke, his voice low, like he wasn't sure he should say it. "My wife Dorothy, she's why I'm out here. She's got a bad heart. Doctors say she needs surgery soon or..." He trailed off, staring at his boots. Keanu turned his head, listening. "That's rough," he said, keeping it simple. Harold nodded, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, costs more than we've got. Sold the car last year, picked up extra shifts here, keeps the lights on, barely. But the surgery, that's a whole other thing." His voice cracked a little, and he cleared his throat, embarrassed. "I'm not as strong as I used to be. Knees give out, back's shot, but stopping's not an option. She's all I've got left." Keanu's eyes softened, a flicker of something, sympathy maybe, crossing his face. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "How long's she been sick?" he asked. Harold sighed, running a hand over his cap. "Couple years now. Started small, tired all the time, short of breath. Then it got worse. She's home now, mostly in bed. I hate leaving her alone, but this job's all we've got. Can't afford to lose it." He paused, then added quieter. "She doesn't complain, though. Never has. Keeps telling me she's fine, even when I know she's not." Keanu nodded, taking it in. He'd heard stories like this before, people stretched thin, holding on by a thread. But Harold stuck with him. The guy wasn't asking for pity, just stating facts. "Ever think about asking for help?" Keanu said, his voice careful, not pushing too hard. Harold's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "Nah, don't want to bother anybody. Folks have their own problems. Always figured a man's supposed to handle his own mess. Been that way my whole life." He looked at Keanu, half expecting judgment, but found none. Keanu just sat there, letting the words settle. "I get that," he said after a beat. "Pride's a hell of a thing, but sometimes it's okay to let someone in." Harold didn't respond right away, just stared out at the lot. He wasn't used to this. Someone listening, not fixing, just hearing him out. Keanu didn't push further. He'd planted the seed, and that was enough for now. Harold shifted, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. He didn't know this guy, but something about him made it hard to stay closed off. Harold lingered on the curb, his words about Dorothy fading into the dusk. Keanu stood, brushing off his jeans. "I'll let you get back," he said, keeping it light. Harold nodded, still puzzled by this stranger who'd listened so easily. "Yeah, thanks again," he mumbled, hauling himself up with a grunt. Keanu waved, then headed for his motorcycle. Harold watched him go, assuming that was it, just a guy who'd pitched in and moved on. But Keanu had other plans. He reached the bike, paused, then turned toward the store entrance instead, his stride sharp and deliberate. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered as he zeroed in on the manager's office. Todd was there, hunched over a desk buried in papers, calculator clicking furiously. His tie was loose, sweat beading on his forehead. He was late on payroll numbers, and the district manager had been riding him all week. Keanu knocked, and Todd's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "What now?" he barked, voice tight with stress. "You lost or something?" Keanu stepped in, pulling a check from his jacket and sliding it across the desk. "This is for Harold," he said, low and calm. Todd glanced at it, then froze. The amount was huge, 5 figures, way more than he'd expected. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, snatching it up, his fingers twitching. "You some rich nut job? What's your angle?" Keanu stayed cool. "Give him a few weeks off, paid. Call it a company bonus, good work, whatever. Just don't say it's from me." Todd's jaw clenched, his mind racing. "Why? What's in it for you? I've got enough crap to deal with. Corporate's up my ass, and now you're pulling this?" "Doesn't matter," Keanu said, unflinching. "He's proud. Won't take it if he knows." Can you make it work? Todd slammed the check down, leaning forward, his voice rising. You think I'm your errand boy? I don't even know you. This could be fake. Hell, you could be scamming me. His eyes darted to the phone, half tempted to call security, but Keanu's steady gaze held him. It's real. Check it if you want. Just do it soon. Todd's hands shook as he stared at the numbers again, torn between the pressure crushing him and the cash in front of him. Fine, he spat finally. I'll say it's a damn loyalty bonus. But if this blows up, it's on you. Keanu nodded. Good. He turned to leave, ignoring Todd's muttered curses. Outside, Keanu pulled his phone as he reached his bike. He dialed a local charity contact, skipping pleasantries when a woman answered. Hey, it's me. Favor time. Woman named Dorothy, heart condition, needs surgery fast. Husband's Harold, works at the supermarket off Route 12. Can you get her free medical aid? She hesitated, asking for specifics. Keanu gave what he had. Harold's story, bare bones but enough. Keep it anonymous, he added. No names, no link to me or him. They can't know. We'll figure it out, she said. Might take a couple days, call it a random grant. I'll confirm when it's set. Keanu let out a breath. Thanks. He hung up, glancing back at the store. Harold was probably clocking out now, clueless. Todd, though. Keanu could picture him sweating over that check, paranoid it'd unravel his already shaky job. The guy was a mess, but he'd do it. The money was too good to ditch. Keanu climbed onto his bike, feeling the weight of his choices. He wasn't here for drama, never was, but Harold's situation had hooked him. The old man needed a lifeline, and Dorothy needed a shot. That's what mattered. He pulled his cap down, fired up the engine, and peeled out of the lot, already plotting how to keep this quiet. The next morning, Harold woke early, the weight of another day pressing on his chest. He shuffled to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and checked on Dorothy. She was still in bed, her breathing shallow, her face pale against the pillows. He hated seeing her like this, fragile, fading, but he forced a smile, brushing her hair back. Morning, hun, he whispered. She didn't stir much, just nodded faintly. He was about to head out for his shift when the doorbell rang. Harold frowned, not expecting anyone, and opened it to find a young woman in a neat blazer holding a clipboard. Mr. Harold? She asked, her voice brisk but kind. He nodded, wary. I'm with Community Health Aid. We're here about your wife, Dorothy. She's been approved for a fully funded heart surgery, effective immediately, courtesy of an anonymous donor. Harold blinked, the words not sinking in. What? He croaked. She smiled. A grant came through last night. No cost to you. We'll handle everything. Hospital, doctors, all of it. Can we come in to finalize details? Harold stood there, stunned, his hand gripping the doorframe. It felt like the floor had dropped out, but in a good way. Like a burden he'd carried for years, had just vanished. Yeah, come in, he managed, stepping aside. He led her to the bedroom, still dazed. Dorothy looked up, confused, as the woman explained again. Surgery set for tomorrow if you're ready, she said. Harold sank onto the bed beside Dorothy, his mind reeling. An anonymous donor. He didn't know anyone with that kind of money. The woman finished her paperwork and left, promising a call later. Alone again, Harold turned to Dorothy, who'd been watching him silently. She reached for his hand, her fingers weak but warm. Did you pray somewhere I didn't see? She asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips, her first real one in months. Weeks later, Keanu rolled back into the supermarket parking lot on his motorcycle, engine growling softly as he parked in his usual corner. He stayed astride the bike, watching from a distance. Harold was out there again, pushing carts, but something was different. His steps were lighter, his shoulders less hunched. Dorothy's surgery had gone well. Keanu had gotten the word from his charity contact days ago. He'd meant to keep it quiet, to let Harold have his peace without strings. Seeing the old man now, he felt a quiet satisfaction, enough to call it done. He was about to pull away when a shout broke his thoughts. "Hey you, office!" It was Todd, leaning out the store entrance, waving him in. Keanu frowned, hesitating, then cut the engine and walked over. Inside the office, Todd was pacing, a smug edge to his grin that set Keanu on edge. "I know who you are," Todd said, jabbing a finger at him. "Nah, caught you on the security cam that day, handing me that check. Thought you could play the ghost, huh?" Keanu's stomach sank, but he kept his face blank. Todd leaned closer, voice low and sharp. "I didn't keep it quiet like you wanted. Told a couple guys at the bar, figured they'd want to know some hero was throwing cash around. Word's out now, man." He smirked, crossing his arms. "Whole town's buzzing about the mystery guy on the bike." Keanu's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists in his pockets. He'd asked one thing, keep it under wraps, and Todd had blown it. "Why?" he said, voice flat. Todd shrugged, defensive. "People deserve to know. You're a big shot, right? What's the harm?" Keanu didn't answer. The harm was this: rumors spreading like wildfire, eyes on him when all he'd wanted was to help and fade out. He stared Todd down for a beat, then turned and walked out, the manager's laugh trailing after him. Outside, he climbed onto his bike, mind racing. The lot was empty, but he could feel the shift. People would start looking, asking, digging. He hated that. Across the lot, Harold paused mid-push, catching the tail end of Keanu's exit. He'd heard the whispers at the gas station that morning. Folks talking about a guy on a motorcycle, some do-gooder tossing money around. It clicked then. The stranger who'd helped him. The bonus that didn't add up. He glanced at the empty spot where the bike had been, a hunch settling in. Later, as he straightened a cart, something caught his eye. A scrap of paper tucked under the handle. He pulled it free, unfolding it, scrawled in rough ink, "Don't let them ruin the good." Harold stared at it, piecing it together. That guy, Keanu, hadn't just helped with the carts. He'd changed everything, and now the town wouldn't shut up about it. Harold pocketed the note, a wry smile tugging at his lips. He got it. The man didn't want the spotlight, and Todd had screwed him over. Keanu's plan to stay invisible had backfired, turning him into a local legend he'd never meant to be. Harold shook his head, pushing the cart into place. He wouldn't add to the noise. Keanu's secret was safe with him. Back home, Dorothy was waiting, stronger every day. That was what mattered. Out there, Keanu was probably cursing the gossip, but Harold figured he'd done enough. The good wasn't ruined. Not yet. Harold sat by Dorothy's bedside, the hospital room quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor. Her surgery had gone perfectly. Doctors said she'd recover, maybe even come home soon. She slept now, her hand warm in his, her breathing easier than it had been in years. Harold traced her fingers with his thumb, the envelope from Todd, and that scribbled note still heavy in his jacket pocket. He didn't know the man's name, only that he'd been the stranger with the carts, the one who'd set all this in motion. The town was alive with chatter about the mystery guy, but Harold wouldn't add to it. Whoever he was, he'd wanted it quiet, and Harold owed him that much. Gratitude filled his chest, not just for the money or the surgery, but for the reminder that kindness could show up when you least expected it. Miles away, Keanu rode his motorcycle out of town, the highway stretching under a fading sunset. His cap was pulled low, his face tight with a mix of relief and regret. Dorothy was safe, Harold was steady. That was the win. But Todd's big mouth had turned his quiet help into a circus, and it gnawed at him. He'd never liked the spotlight. It muddied things, made them less real. Next time, he muttered into the wind, I'll be smarter about it. The road ahead was open, endless, and he let it pull him forward, leaving the rumors behind. Maybe he'd stop somewhere new, help someone else. Quieter this time. Life's funny that way. Sometimes the best things we do get messy, get loud, even when we don't want them to. Harold and Keanu showed us that kindness doesn't need a name or a stage. It's the act that matters, the ripple it leaves. We all carry burdens, some like Harold's, some quieter, but a hand offered in the dark can change everything. So what about you? Ever had someone step in when you needed it most? Drop a comment below. Tell us your story, your town, your moment. If this hit you, share it with someone who gets it. Hit that subscribe button too. Tomorrow's story might just spark something in you. Kindness is out there. Sometimes it's just waiting for us to notice.